The wind was a sculptor of the desolate plains, carving dust into ghosts and whispering through the skeleton trees like a lament. He hunkered lower by the meager fire, its warmth a fragile defiance against the biting chill that had become his constant companion. Days bled into weeks, then months, each dawn a stark repetition of hardship. He had built this life, if it could be called life, a solitary, grim existence wrestled from the indifferent earth. There had been others once, but the unforgiving land, or the even less forgiving people who sometimes drifted through it, had seen to their passing. Now only the wind and the endless horizon bore witness to his survival. He was alone. He had accepted it, welcomed it, even as a shield against the inevitable pain of loss. His face, weathered and hardened, bore the lines of too much sun and too little hope. His eyes, the color of faded denim, scanned the empty distance out of habit, not expectation. Nothing ever came this way but the storm or the rare, wary traveler who gave him a wide berth. Then the ghost of dust took form. Small, stumbling, barely visible against the dun-colored landscape. He rose slowly, every muscle protesting, hand drifting instinctively towards the worn stock of the rifle propped against the makeshift shelter. Couldn't be. No one would be out here this far from any trail or settlement, certainly not alone and on foot. As the figure drew nearer, its movements uncertain, a chilling certainty settled in his gut. It was human, and it was failing. He lowered the rifle, caution warring with a primal, unwelcome stir of something akin to alarm. A woman, slight, wrapped in what looked like rags, collapsing more than walking. His mind raced, cataloging the dangers she represented: a burden, a target for others, a disruption to his hard-won equilibrium. But his feet carried him forward, meeting her halfway across the wind-scoured ground. She crumpled just as he reached her, a silent heap of frail humanity at his boots. He knelt, his movements stiff, observing the rise and fall of her chest beneath the tattered fabric, shallow and rapid. Her face was smudged with dirt and fear, her eyes tightly closed. A shallow cut bled sluggishly on her temple. She was young, too young to be alone out here, too fragile for this brutal world. He hesitated for only a moment. The choice was stark. Leave her to the elements, quick and clean, or invite the unpredictable chaos of another life into his own. The wind howled, seeming to mock his solitude, reminding him of the vast, crushing loneliness he carried. With a sigh that was lost to the air, he gently, awkwardly, gathered her into his arms. She was feather-light, shockingly so. He carried her back to the fire, the weight a strange, unsettling pressure against his chest. He laid her down on his bedroll, noticing the trembling of her limbs even in unconsciousness. He knelt beside her, watching the firelight play across her features. She was a disruption, a problem he hadn't anticipated. But looking at her, vulnerable and adrift in his isolated world, something shifted within him. The solitude he had embraced felt suddenly, overwhelmingly, like emptiness. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of the fire and her shallow, desperate breaths. He found himself waiting, not just for her to wake, but for something undefined to change. The night closed in, vast and indifferent, but now, for the first time in a long time, he was not truly alone within its immensity. The fragile connection born of necessity and shared vulnerability had begun its silent, arduous journey. He tended the fire, adding brush carefully, watching the flames lick the dry wood. The woman slept fitfully on his bedroll, wrapped in his spare blanket, a small, still form against the rough canvas. He had cleaned the cut on her temple with water from his canteen and a strip torn from his own shirt, his hands surprisingly gentle for their callous state. She hadn't stirred much, only a soft moan escaping her lips once. He sat some distance away, sharpening a knife, the scrape of steel on stone the only sound besides the wind and her quiet breathing. He didn't look at her constantly, but his awareness of her presence was absolute. Every rustle of the blanket, every shift of her weight, registered with him. He was a man of routine, of predictable solitude. This was a violation of that order, a wild card thrown into a carefully controlled game of survival. Why had she been out there? Where had she come from? He asked the questions only of himself, knowing she couldn't answer yet, maybe not ever. He was wary, instinctively so. People brought complications, trouble. They had before. Yet he hadn't left her. He hadn't turned his back. An unfamiliar current ran beneath his usual stoicism, a reluctance to see something so clearly broken left to break further. He watched her chest rise and fall, the steady rhythm a small victory against the vast indifference of the plains. He noted the fine dust embedded in her skin, the chapped state of her lips. She had traveled far, or perhaps just poorly equipped for even a short journey. When morning light painted the sky in cold, pale hues, she finally stirred. Her eyes, when they opened, were wide and a startling shade of blue, filled with confusion and a deep, residual fear. She looked at the canvas overhead, then slowly turned her head, her gaze meeting his. She didn't speak, just stared, her eyes searching his face for something: threat, reassurance, understanding. He held her gaze, offering nothing in his expression but a steady presence. He didn't smile, didn't offer platitudes. Words felt useless, perhaps even dangerous, in this place at this moment. He simply nodded towards the fire, then gestured towards a small pot. He had heated water. He poured some into a tin cup and offered it to her. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, her fingers brushing his briefly. The contact was electric, a tiny shock in the vast silence. She took the cup, her eyes not leaving his. She drank slowly, gratefully, the warmth seeming to infuse a little life back into her. She still hadn't spoken. Was she unable? Unwilling? It didn't matter. Her presence was a language in itself, a story of hardship etched onto a young face, a testament to a struggle he could only guess at. He offered her a piece of dry jerky next. She hesitated, then took it, her movements still fragile. As she ate, slowly, deliberately, she finally spoke, her voice a low, husky whisper, barely audible above the wind. "Thank you." It was just 2 words, simple and profound. He simply nodded again, acknowledging the debt, the unexpected connection forged in the crucible of shared need. The silence returned, but it was different now, less empty, holding the weight of her whispered gratitude and the unspoken understanding that had begun to bridge the gap between them. Days blurred into a rhythm dictated by survival and the quiet presence of another. She, who finally offered the name Alara, recovered slowly, the spark returning to her eyes, though the fear never entirely left them. She didn't speak much of where she came from, or how she ended up alone on the plains. He didn't ask. In this world, pasts were often burdens best left unexamined. What mattered was the now, the stark reality of coexisting in a place that offered no quarter. She learned quickly, watching him with those intelligent, quiet eyes, how to tend the fire efficiently, how to mend torn fabric with clumsy but determined fingers, how to ration water as if it were liquid gold. She wasn't strong in the way of lifting heavy things, but her resilience was a quiet, deep-seated strength. She cleaned his small living space, organized his meager supplies, found uses for things he had discarded as useless. Small acts, but they brought a sense of order to his chaotic existence. He, in turn, began to adjust. He spoke sparingly, his words clipped and practical, but he watched her. He noticed the way she flinched at sudden loud noises, the way her gaze constantly scanned the horizon, not just for him, but for perceived threats. He saw the determination in her jaw when she struggled with a task, the quiet satisfaction when she succeeded. He would leave small pieces of jerky within her reach, or ensure she was sheltered from the worst of the wind. He taught her to identify edible plants, how to track small game, the basics of handling his rifle, not to shoot, but to understand its weight, its function. Trust grew not through grand gestures or declarations, but through shared silences, mutual observation, and the unspoken pact of survival. They were 2 solitary stars drawn into a single, fragile orbit. Their connection wasn't fire, but the steady glow of embers, banked and protected against the cold. One afternoon, the horizon shimmered with more than just heat haze. Riders, 3 of them, hard-looking men, their presence announced by a cloud of dust and the glint of metal. His hand went instantly to his rifle. Trouble had found them. Elara froze beside him, her eyes wide with a familiar terror he now recognized. These were the kind of men who saw vulnerability as an invitation. The kind of men he had learned to avoid at all costs. They rode straight towards the shelter, their faces grim and assessing. One, a burly man with a scarred face, pulled his horse to a halt a few yards away, his gaze sweeping over their camp, lingering on Elara. "Well now," he drawled, his voice rough as gravel. "Didn't expect to find folks out here, especially not such pretty company." His eyes held a calculating, cruel light. The air crackled with tension. This was the external threat, sharp and immediate, that had been lurking on the edges of their fragile peace. It was a test, not just of their ability to defend themselves, but of the silent bond they had forged. In that moment, their isolation wasn't a shield, but a vulnerability. The world outside had found them, and it demanded a price. He raised his rifle slowly, his gaze locking onto the lead rider. Beside him, Elara didn't run, didn't scream. She stood her ground, her eyes fixed on the men, her small body radiating a fierce, quiet resolve. The silent trust between them solidified into an unbreakable line against the encroaching darkness. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring. The scarred man dismounted slowly, 2 others flanking him, their hands resting on their weapon hilts. The air tasted of dust and impending violence. "We ain't lookin' for trouble," the scarred man said, but his eyes contradicted the words, fixed on Elara with predatory interest. He didn't reply immediately, his focus absolute on the lead rider, assessing his intentions, his movements. Elara stood slightly behind him, a silent, unwavering presence. He could feel her closeness, not a burden, but a strength. He had faced men like this alone before, relying on speed and surprise. But now there was something else to protect. His grip tightened on the rifle. "Then keep ridin'," he said, his voice low and steady, devoid of fear. The scarred man chuckled, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Can't do that. Not when we see a pretty thing like her bein' hoarded out here in the waste." He took a step forward. "She with you, old man?" He saw the trap in the question. Claiming her meant claiming responsibility and drawing their full aggression. Denying her meant abandoning her. But there was no hesitation this time. Their shared ordeal, the quiet days of building something fragile but real between them, had already answered the question. "She's with me," he stated clearly, unequivocally. The words, simple as they were, felt like a vow in the vast, indifferent landscape. The scarred man's face twisted into a sneer. "Big talk for a man alone out here. Looks like you found something precious." And things that precious got a price. The other 2 men fanned out slightly. The confrontation was inevitable. Elara stepped forward, slightly, not challenging, but standing beside him, her small act of defiance potent. He didn't look at her, his eyes locked on the threats, but he registered her movement, felt the shift in the air around them. It wasn't just his fight anymore. He shifted his weight, bringing the rifle to bear. The first shot cracked through the air, not from his rifle, but from the scarred man, aimed deliberately low, kicking up dirt near his boots. A warning, or an opening move. He reacted instantly, years of ingrained survival kicking in. He fired, the rifle bucking against his shoulder. The lead rider cried out, clutching his arm, staggering back towards his horse. The element of surprise, however slight, was theirs. The other 2 men reacted, drawing their revolvers, but he was already moving, taking cover behind a cluster of rocks. Elara, without a word, dropped to the ground, crawling behind the same cover, clutching a rock in her hand. He glanced at her, a flicker of surprise at her quick, intuitive action. This wasn't the helpless woman he'd found. This was someone who had learned to survive, who faced danger not with passive fear, but with quiet, focused determination. He fired again, forcing the riders to scatter, seeking cover themselves. A brief, fierce gunfight erupted, shots echoing strangely in the open space. He moved between cover, reloading with practiced ease, his mind clear and sharp. He could hear Alara's ragged breathing beside him, but also her stillness, her presence a grounding force. One of the other riders went down, a cry cut short. The third, seeing their advantage gone and their numbers depleted, hesitated for only a second before wheeling his horse around and galloping back the way they came, dragging the injured leader behind him. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the wind and the pounding of his own heart. He stayed alert for a long moment, ensuring they were truly gone, before lowering his rifle. He turned to Alara, who was slowly rising, her face pale but resolute. "You all right?" he asked, the question rough but sincere. She nodded, her eyes meeting his, a mixture of shock and something that looked like awe. "Yes," she whispered, then added, You were incredible," he grunted, dismissing the praise, scanning the horizon one last time. But her words settled within him, a warmth against the cold edge of the recent danger. They had faced down the threat together, not as protector and protected, but as partners in survival. The quiet bond had been tested in fire and had held firm. In the aftermath, the air between them hummed with a new understanding, a deeper connection forged in the crucible of shared peril. The external world had tried to break them apart, but instead, it had welded them together. They were no longer just two solitary figures enduring the wilderness. They were a unit, bound by necessity, trust, and the silent promise of standing together against whatever the plains might send their way. The sun dipped towards the horizon, casting long shadows, but the darkness no longer felt quite so absolute. In the aftermath, a stillness settled, different from the previous solitude. It was the quiet that follows a storm, or a battle heavy with what had passed, yet holding the fragile promise of peace. They gathered the few things left behind by the fleeing men, mostly useless scraps, but symbols of the danger repelled. He tended to his own minor scrapes, the kind that barely registered. Alara watched him, her expression thoughtful. She moved with a newfound confidence, the vulnerability still present, but now overlaid with a layer of hard-earned resilience. She had faced down fear, and in doing so, had found a strength she perhaps hadn't known she possessed. They ate their evening meal by the fire, the silence comfortable now, companionable. There were no grand pronouncements of their bond, no effusive expressions of gratitude. That wasn't their way. Their connection existed in the shared look, the unspoken understanding that had passed between them during the confrontation. He knew, without needing words, that she would not have left, even if she could have. And she knew, with the same silent certainty, that he would have stood against any odds to protect her. It was a bond forged in necessity, hammered by hardship, and tempered by shared peril, stronger, perhaps, than any connection built on easier ground. He looked at her across the flames, the firelight softening the harsh lines of his face. She was no longer the mysterious, fragile waif who had stumbled into his life. She was Alara, a survivor, a partner, a quiet light in the desolate landscape. He hadn't thought he needed anyone. He had been fiercely protective of his solitude, seeing it as his only true defense. But her presence hadn't weakened him. It had given his survival purpose beyond mere existence. It had given him something to stand for, to fight for. The emptiness that had been the core of his solitude had been filled, not with noise or complication, but with a quiet, steady companionship. She met his gaze, and in her eyes, he saw not fear, but acceptance, resilience, and a deep, quiet trust. The instant connection wasn't a spark of romance, but the immediate, undeniable pull of two isolated souls recognizing a shared need for something more than solitude. The instant was the moment their paths converged. The connection, the slow, organic growth of interdependence and quiet care. The wind still whispered through the skeletal trees, the plains still stretched out vast and indifferent, but they faced it together now. Their lives would continue to be hard, marked by scarcity and the ever-present threat of the world outside. But they were no longer alone. He had thought he was complete in his solitude, but she had shown him the quiet dignity of shared resilience. Alara, fragile yet strong, had not just survived the wilderness. She had awakened him from a different kind of wilderness, the one within. As the stars began to prick the inky sky, they sat by the fire, two figures against the immensity, their silence a testament to the profound, unspoken bond that had bloomed in the most unlikely of places. They had found each other, not in comfort or ease, but in the crucible of the desolate plains, and in doing so had found a piece of themselves they hadn't known was missing. They would face tomorrow and whatever it brought, side by side.